With that, my name is Stephen Cook, and I'm your moderator for the next two presentations. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Heidi Steltzer from Fort Lewis College in Colorado, in the USA. And we're going to hear what I think is going to be a really interesting talk that brings together plant biology, watershed function, and water supply. Take it away, Professor Steltzer.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I've looked through the participants list and I can see that I only know a few of you. So I'm really excited and grateful for this opportunity to connect with everyone and to begin to share some stories of the work I've been doing in Colorado and where and how this fits into a larger story of changing snow and ice in our world that's been part of this whole Winter Biology Conference, and bringing it to some of how do we know what we know? Are there more ways of knowing out there? Because there are some limits to the process of science, the Western approach to learning about our natural world and our part in the natural world, because we're part of it, that I want to highlight. So I began my career as a mountain scientist in Colorado with a very observational approach to understanding mountain systems. And in 2007, I stepped into doing more experiments in Colorado. I'd been doing some global change experiments in Greenland and in the Arctic. And in Colorado since 2007, I've been doing these early snowmelt experiments. The original, what you're seeing is a picture of the early snowmelt experiment. It's black fabric on top of snowpack, where Pam has whole teams shoveling snow. I have small teams. So this is one field manager and I going out and laying fabric on snow. So we don't shovel, we melt, and we use the radiative properties. It was originally designed to be something that mimicked dust on snow, which is an issue in the region of the US that I live in. But in the end, we're changing the timing of when land is snow free. And just like with what Pam Templer shared in hers, there's no perfect experiment, and that's a little bit of what I want to get at, is how easy is it to isolate single factors anymore and know where and why a pattern is happening, either due to the extreme climate years that we see or to the experiments we create. I'm on social media, and I'd love to connect with you all since many of you all are new. So that's me on social media, is at Heidi Mountains. Next slide. So we melt snow early, and this is a picture of what it looks like. Hopefully you should be able to see that there is a rectangular area that's 10 meters wide by 14 meters long that has greener ground and flowering glacier lilies and other species. There's spring beauty and other plants popping up earlier, whereas the control hill slope all around is still brown. So we know that when we change the timing of snowmelt, or across climate years, snowmelt is earlier, that the ground will green up earlier and plants will flower earlier. Next slide. I want to describe a little bit what motivates this kind of research on studying the impacts of changing snow. At the most basic is that snow provides water to many species and to people around the world. And that in some regions, that's all the blue zones of the world are all snow dominated watershed systems. And in some regions of the world, including the region that I live in the Western US, we are highly dependent on snow. There isn't ice and glaciers. There isn't a lot of rainfall. So the Southwestern US, Scandinavia, Russia, all stand out as areas that are highly dependent on snow. And the Southwestern US is one where we really don't have much else for water supply other than what snow provides. Next slide. I've taken to describing what snow does in the mountains this way. And I hope that even among a group of scientists, we can talk about the magical characteristics of snow. We may never know all of what snow does for plants, for insects, for the microbes and fungi in the soils, and for people across the regions of our world that have long relied on and been dependent on snow. This is a photo of very soon after snowmelt. Those are false corn lily and glacier lilies coming up in a mountain, the East River watershed here in Colorado. And it is mind-blowing to me, even 30 years into living in Colorado, every year for how fast plants can grow and just what a driver of the whole system that timing of snowmelt is, and that the timing of snowmelt is shifting because there is less snow, because there is a warmer climate with warmer temperatures during the time when snow melts, because there is dust on snow. It changes the radiative properties. And this year in particular, 2022, we had epic winds. Everybody in my community and across my region said that we hadn't seen or experienced winds like we experienced this year in April and into May. 6 weeks of really, really unpleasant windy weather and more dust than we're used to getting, even in a region that gets a lot of desert dust. And all of these are processes that drive the loss of snow, so that we see snow gone in the mountains faster, even when in March we can see that we have 100 or 120% of the new normal for snowpack. Next slide. As I mentioned, the dust comes in. The deserts are near mountains is a characteristic of mountain regions around the world. I'm at the western end of the Colorado Rockies, adjacent to the Colorado Plateau. This is a photo from out in Bears Ears National Monument. And there are lots of processes that change in deserts at the same time that processes are changing in mountains. And it's that interconnection between these two landscapes that is having huge influences on inputs to the region and likely the wind and the wind characteristics we saw this spring. Next slide. Just to give you another sense of place for where I'm talking about, the star in North America shows the location of the study site, and it's in the upper Colorado River Basin. The upper Colorado River Basin is that intermediate pink, not the hot pink, not the light pink, but the intermediate pink zone. And that's the water for the Southwest. It's Arizona's water, it's Utah's water, it's a big part of Nevada and California's water. And in really good years, it's some water for Mexico. And it's a highly regulated water basin with a lot of water management that goes back to the 1800s and the late early 1900s, and ways that water has to be used by people who have the rights or lost, and really complicated politics that include indigenous communities only recently having rights to some of this water. So where and how much water is in this watershed is important for a huge number of people in a system that doesn't necessarily protect the vulnerable. Next slide. This is a graph of climate data over the past 40 years from the region where I did the most recent snowmelt experiment. On the x-axis is snowmelt date. So that's from April till early-ish July for snowmelt date, and times when these climate stations that have been present in the region show areas that are snow-free. And on the y-axis is the thaw degree days for 14 days after snowmelt. So a sum of temperature each day, adding on, never subtracting. So if it's negative and freezing, it's just a 0. And I added it up just like we would for growing degree days. And what I want you to see is there's a relationship. So the earlier that snowmelt occurs, the cooler it is after snowmelt, because there are some characteristics of the Earth system that we're not changing, which includes that, we're going to have shorter days and less intense sun in those earlier months than we would have in June, closer to the solstice. I've put numbers there for the different years. So what I want you, these are two different climate stations. The open circles are climate stations that are at an upper elevation. The black circles are the same watershed, but climate stations that are a little bit lower in elevation. So across an elevational gradient, we have a pretty big range in dates of snowmelt and how warm it is for the species after snowmelt as they're beginning to green and flower. And then the numbers give you some sense, the dates give you some sense of differences in years. So we can have a year like 2012, where it's very early snowmelt, but fairly cool after snowmelt. We can have a year like 2021. Last year was when we had the heat waves and heat domes across the Western US. So particularly warm in the time period after snowmelt. And 1995 was the first year of my PhD research. Look at that year way out there with really, really late snowmelt. And I note that because what I'm studying for mountain systems and snow and plants in Colorado is not what I thought it was. I did start in an extreme climate year, but those years in the 90s are not at all what it's like to study similar characteristics of mountain systems at this point in time. And what I've started to realize, and I hope I can share with you today through the graphs that I show, is that experiments, as wonderful as they are set within the context of these extreme climate years. And it's good fortune and luck when we happen to have the money, the staff, and the resources to carry out the experiment we want in the way we want in these extreme climate years, whether they're warm and dry with early snowmelt, or cool is what I'd most like as a really cool climate year, so that we can best understand how the system works. Next slide. So all of that data that you saw on the last slide is in gray now. That's the climate data from climate stations. Each of those letters represents one of my study plots. I set up an experiment in which we had 6 plots at each of 4 elevations, ranging from montane into the subalpine, and then some sites that are in the alpine, so the zone above the trees, where we know there are species that can't grow at some of those lower elevations. So there's unique species at each of these different study sites. And as we go up in elevation in Colorado, there is increasingly a lot more snow. The upper subalpine is the zone that is most critical for water supply, because it's where we can easily, even in a low snow year, have 2 and 3 meters of snowpack, and more consistently, lots of snow every year. So the gray is the historical data. The letters are 2 different years across those different study plots. And the small letters are all control plots that we didn't change the timing of snowmelt. And the larger letters are the capital letters are what an experiment can do. So the length of the arrow and the direction of the arrow helps you to get a sense for when I put black fabric on top of snow for a period of about 2 to 3 weeks, how much can I shift the timing of snowmelt, and with that also shift the thaw degree days and how warm it is after snowmelt. So it gives you a sense of what we can shift, and it gives you a sense that we can't change snowmelt timing without also changing how warm the environment is in which those plants are greening and growing. Next slide. This is a lot. I will do a brief job of explaining the slide in this set of graphs, but I kind of just wanted to put it all out there at once. So the pattern that we saw is increasingly synchronized greening and flowering across elevation. This is in contrast to Hopkins' bioclimatic law from the early 1900s, where in any mountain system or across mountain, lowland to mountain regions, we would expect to see asynchronous greening and flowering. So low elevations green first, high elevations green later. So elevation in meters is on the x-axis in these. The leafing is on the left, the flowering is on the right. And then sequentially in each graph, as we go from the top to the bottom, the data in the graph just above becomes grayed out in the bottom graph, the one graph lower. And that's so what you can see is that in 2017, a more normal climate year in Colorado and in control plots, we could see a pattern of roughly a 60-day difference for 1,000 meters from low elevation to high elevation in the offset of the asynchronicity of greening and 41 days for flowering. By 2018, which was a fairly extreme climate year for Colorado, and that's just the the luck of the draw that we happened to begin the project in 2017 and have be able to continue it in 2018. You can see that for leafing, that only shifts by a few days, from 60 days to 56 days. But for flowering in a really warm year with an early snowmelt, historically 2018 was, there's only like 2 years, 3 years in the data record. That's not to say that there aren't more years that we don't have data for in the region, climate data for. It was a really early snowmelt, and you can see that the flowering was more synchronous across elevation. And then when we go to the earlier snowmelt, what we were able to achieve with that experiment is pushing snowmelt earlier than we think it's ever historically occurred based on the data we have. That's not, again, it's, there's some limits for what data we have. So it was incredibly early in these early snowmelt plots. And we can see that for leafing, we've roughly halved the synchronicity. So it's gone from 60 days to 36 days for offset. And then for 2018, in the earlier snowmelt, there's no variation in the timing of flowering. So you can show up in Crested Butte, Colorado, and see all the wildflowers blooming at 3,000 meters in town. And you can go up to the mountaintops and they're all blooming up there as well. The reason the synchronization happens is because the upper elevations shift more than the lower elevations. The lower elevations, you can see, don't drop that far below the gray from the graphs above them, but the upper elevations continue to drop a lot. And we've characterized that, quantified it, and have a whole nother analysis that we did on that. And this is sort of the big picture view of what the consequences are of that difference in how high elevation and low elevation species are responding. Next slide. So this gives you a sense of 2018. We make these water graphs every year to understand these hydrographs, nivographs, I've heard them called. This is the water in the snow. And 2018 was a year with exceptionally low water. And then we model, and we model hope in Colorado and probably in other regions of the world. We model what could come for late season snow. But in 2018, what we saw was that the actual snowpack follows that red line, that thin red line, not the hopeful blue line. And we live with a lot of hope. I think that's a part of characteristics of the human species. And when I show you that graph of the synchronization of mountain plant growth across elevation, it's not the story that I want to tell. And I don't really want to find out what the consequences of that are. To date, there aren't a lot of species that have been lost in the mountains of Colorado. So local extinctions or regional extinctions. A lot of the work I did with the IPCC when I worked on the special report on the oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate focused on where and how species may be lost from mountain regions as a result of changing snow. I want to live more in this hope space, and that hope space isn't optimism without action and commitment to being part of the change that needs to take place. So hope is an action verb. We can model hope, and we can and should be acting with a focus on hope. And I realize that I'm deviating from the norm from typical science forum to be stepping into this space. So next slide. And I think, Steve, do I have a couple more minutes? Almost done? Okay. Here's where I'll go with this. This is what the north-facing slopes of Colorado look like these days. And this is not what they look like when I started my PhD. There should be snow on those north-facing slopes well into summer. And this is June in 2020. Next slide. What I'll encourage is that we shift our focus. Where and how do we put what we want at the center of our narratives? I don't want the center of the narratives that I tell and speak to be about the loss of snow, but to what actions can we take to sustain snow in our world and sustain the well-being of other species on which we depend. What actions am I taking to work in this space? Next slide. I've focused efforts on living in a rural region of the US in a fairly conservative region of the US and bringing forward the stories, my stories of mountain science from the past 30 years, and the stories of the Indigenous communities with which I engage, because I'm a professor at an Indigenous serving institution, about where and how do we know in different ways than in the tradition of Western science, and where and how do we connect to the earth and one another in meaningful ways. And with that, I'll close and hope to inspire some questions during the business meeting in this direction.